Now, if there's one thing that we can never seem to get right, that's our settings. If you're like me, then you probably change them often. But the reason you find it difficult to get the perfect setup is you're probably copying somebody else's. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to get the perfect settings for you.
Let's do this.
But it doesn't work. I try to say something.
So the first thing we need to talk about is field of view, or FOV. And what you'll find is that most pro players will work with a 110 or 109. And that's simply because the majority of their life will revolve around 3v3. And then if you take Evampel, for example, I think he uses 108. So that's slightly more zoomed in than what a pro would use. So with that being said, you have to pick a field of view that works for you. I would say if you're predominantly a 2v2 or 3v3 player, you really want to be going with like 109 or 110. I use 110 myself. Now, I would suggest not having camera shake on. Obviously, if you want more of an arcade effect, you could use camera shake. I guess the only time camera shake might be helpful is that it gives you an indication on when you actually hit the ball. But other than that, I don't really see the point of having camera shake. Now, distance is the distance between the camera and your car. So the higher you go with distance, the further away the camera will go from your car. Now, you'll find most of the pros use between 260 to 290. I use 290 myself. And then you get freestylers that will use a lower distance. And that's simply because they want to focus on the car more with the ball because they have to get precise touches. And one thing I find a lot of people don't think about, when they're changing their camera settings, which I think is super important, is actually aerials. So it's no good you coming into free play and just like changing your settings here and just thinking, right, they look good, I'm going to use them. You actually want to test out your settings and you want to aerial as well as do ground plays. But the camera distance is definitely down to preference. I would start around sort of 270, 280 and kind of, work from there. I like to think of camera height as like a crosshair in an FPS. So if you have it really low, think of like an FPS, you would have your crosshair like further down the screen. It doesn't really make much sense to me. And it's the same with having a very high camera height. You wouldn't have your crosshair at the top of the screen. Now, I would say if you're more of a ground player, like if you like to dribble a lot, I would go with a lower height. And if you're more an aerial type player, then you kind of want to go slightly higher. So you might find dribbling easier or bounce dribbles if you go for like a 90 height. And then you'll find if you go slightly higher, it might improve your aerial game. But again, these are things you have to test, like, just jump into free play and just test out different mechanics and, see what works best. But I go for a 110 myself. Now, camera angle is pretty straightforward. Again, it's going to come down to whether you like to dribble a lot or if you're more of an aerial player. I actually use -3 angle myself because I like it quite high, and that's because I don't like to be looking down at my car. I like to be looking straight forward. Now, I think stiffness is one of these settings that a lot of people get confused with, and because a lot of players, like pro players, they will use a wider range of stiffness compared to the other settings, and that's purely because it comes down to preference. Now, stiffness is just how close the camera stays to your car when you're supersonic, basically, or when you're moving. If you see when I go fast, my car pulls away from the screen. Your car will basically go further away from the screen, the lower you have your stiffness. So if you use a low stiffness, you see my car goes really far from the screen. And if I use a high stiffness, then obviously it won't go as far. Now, this gets back to the point I was making before, of that if you just change your camera settings while on the ground, you will set your camera settings up for your ground play, but your camera settings won't be set up for your aerial play. And this is where stiffness is important, because when you're in the air, stiffness still plays a part. And that's why you'll generally find that most players that like to keep the ball on the ground dribble a lot, they will use a high stiffness. And then a lot of players that like to go in the air, they will use a lower stiffness. I change this often, but the current stiffness that I'm using is 0.5 because the camera turns a little bit too fast for me with high stiffness. Like I say, try stiffness out for yourself. And don't just try it out on the ground, also go into the air. Now, swivel speed is the swivel of the camera. So it's when your car moves, how quick you want the camera to swivel with it. Now here, I would say you want to test different settings. So you might find that some settings are a little bit disorientating for you. So I would say try a swivel speed and just turn your camera like this and then see how quick it follows your car. And then your transition speed is with the ball cam. So when you switch ball cam off, if you see that goes quite slow. And if I remember rightly, this setting didn't come in until a later update in Rocket League. And when it came in, I actually changed it to 1.5. And that was really disorientating for me, like changing it that quickly because I was so used to having it on 1. But now I use 1.5, I got used to it and it is a lot better because, the quicker you can turn your camera to focus on what you want to focus on, I think the better in game, because then you can make faster decisions. An inverted swivel just changes the way the camera goes. To give you a starting ground, I would just say, you know, if you're used to flying games, then I would turn inverted swivel on. You know, if you're not, then maybe have it off.
Oh, I didn't know all that, so I'm sorry.
So next up, I want to get into controls. Now I have shown my button settings a few times, but here they are again. Now I'd say the main differences here is I use boost on RB and I use Airroll on LB. I also have drift or power slide set to LB as well. So Airroll and power slide are both set to LB. Now another thing I see a lot of people speak about is fixed Airroll. Airroll left and Airroll right. I actually use both. I have X assigned to Airroll left and I have the B button assigned to Airroll right. Now a few people have asked me, should you just have one of these? Should you just have Airroll left or Airroll right? Now my advice is that you want to have as many options available to you as possible. Like, why would you limit yourself? It makes no sense. What if these crazy mechanical kids that are coming through, what if they invent some mechanic where you need both Airroll left and Airroll right? But because you never assigned like both of these buttons to your controller, you're not used to it. So you might be like 1,000 hours into the game and you've only ever used Airroll left, but now you need to pull off this mechanic that uses Airroll left and Airroll right. What are you going to do? So my advice is to have both assigned to your controller. You know, if you just want to have one, that's entirely down to you. Obviously, I think this is the best setup that you can have on your buttons because it makes most things easier. So I would definitely suggest mapping your buttons like this, but you know, it will be hard at first. Like when I changed boost, for example, from B to RB, you know, it was incredibly difficult at first to get used to that. I think I just played unranked for like a week until I got used to it. And then, you know, after getting used to it, it's just so much better.
Let's just pause for a second and let everyone comment. First, don't forget to smash that subscribe button. Hold on.
And then we get into sensitivity settings. Now, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you want to change these often. But to give you a starting point, I usually go with about 1.5 steering sensitivity and 1.7 aerial sensitivity. And I think these settings will become more relevant to you the higher the skill level you climb in the game. So the better you get at the game, you'll find that you'll be changing these settings a lot more. But if you're just starting out or you haven't been playing the game for too long, I wouldn't worry too much about these settings. I would pick settings that work for you, stick with them for a while, and then, as I say, the better you get at the game, the more you will change it. Now, controller settings is just how much you have to push the stick when you turn. I would say your controller dead zone you want to have, say 0.05 to say 0.2. It really does depend on your controller. If you have an older controller, you might find that you need a higher dead zone because you might experience stick drift. So if I play at 0.05, for example, that if I drive, my car turns. I'm not touching the stick, as you can see in the top right corner, but my car just turns on its own. But then you can also affect these settings in your Steam controller settings because you can also change the shape of your dead zone as well. But like I said, I'm not going to go too much into that. There is plenty of stuff out there. Check out Rocket Science, for example. He has some really good videos on all settings and he goes into a lot more detail. I would say these settings you can't copy from somebody else because it has to be set up for your controller specifically. But all these settings will correlate with each other. And then in the interface, I don't change too much. And you might have heard a lot of people say, you know, play with a really high nameplate scale. Like, I guess if you're blind, then yeah, playing with really high. But you know, I usually play with 80%. Sometimes I'll go to like 120, it depends. But I have no problem seeing people on the pitch. And in my video settings, well, this changes, like it depends. So if I'm recording a video for YouTube, I usually have my textures on high. I rarely play Rocket League anymore to solely rank up, but if I did, then I would definitely play on high performance. So I would put all these on high performance and I would turn all these off and I would just use transparent goalposts. And that's everything. But thanks for watching, and until next time.
Half a f***ing penny of you for this shit.